This is a message from a viewer named David, and when I finished reading it, I sat with my coffee going cold for a long time before I could even open a new document. It isn't the story of a foolish tourist who wandered into a beer bar and lost his head to a woman in a short dress. It is worse than that, and quieter, and in some ways more frightening. Because David Pennington Holloway was not the kind of man anyone would have marked as a target. He was a retired history teacher from Sarasota, Florida, 73 years old, widowed, gentle, the sort of man who reads 2 books a week and cuts his own hair. He had taught the Vietnam War to American teenagers for 34 years. He believed, in the way careful people sometimes believe dangerous things, that he understood the country he had never visited. What you are about to hear is what happened when a 19-year-old girl on a language exchange app asked him, one evening in the late Florida winter, if he would be willing to help her with her English. He said yes. He is still, in a real sense, saying yes. He is saying it from a 4th-floor room in a narrow alley off Hang Back Street in Hanoi, where the ceiling fan does not quite work, and where he counts out $30 American in worn Vietnamese notes every morning for another night in a bed he cannot afford to leave. "My name is David Holloway," he wrote, "and I would like to tell you how a man who spent his whole life reading history ended up living inside somebody else's script. If you've been enjoying the stories I tell, please consider hitting the subscribe button. Your support is crucial for the growth of this channel and helps me dedicate time to making these videos despite my commitment to a full-time job. Thank you for being here. I want to start before any of it happened, because I have come to believe that the shape of a person's loneliness is the shape of the door they walk through when they are ruined. And if you understand mine, you will understand the rest. My wife Kate died on a Sunday morning in the spring, 4 years before the first message arrived. Ovarian cancer, 11 months from diagnosis to the last breath. She was a middle school English teacher for 29 years, and she was the reader in our house, the underliner, the woman who kept 2 novels going at once and always finished them both. We had 1 daughter, Sarah, and Sarah had 2 boys of her own up in Rochester, and we had a 2-bedroom condominium in a 55-plus community in Sarasota that we had chosen together the summer I retired. We had a routine. We had a screened porch. We had a small pale dog named Emmett, who outlived Kate by 7 months and then died on the kitchen tile one afternoon, as if he had simply been waiting for permission. After Kate was gone, the condominium became something I cannot quite describe. It was still full of her handwriting. Grocery lists in her looping cursive stuck to the refrigerator, marginal notes in the books on the shelves, her reading glasses on the arm of the couch. I could not throw any of it away, and I could not bear to look at any of it, so I stopped sitting in the living room and started eating my meals standing at the kitchen counter facing the window. My neighbors were kind. The Tuesday breakfast at the clubhouse was full of widowers, and the widowers were angry, and I did not want to become that. I wanted to become a man who was reading and learning and doing something. I told myself I was going to finally learn Vietnamese. I had wanted to learn Vietnamese since 1968, when I was a sophomore in college, and my number came up, and my heart murmur kept me home. Every year, I taught the war to a new group of American 17-year-olds, and every year, I felt the specific weight of a man who had spent his entire professional life explaining a country he had never set foot in. So I downloaded a language exchange app. That is the sentence I would like you to hear clearly, because it is the sentence that most closely names the moment. I did not download a dating app. I did not sign up for a mail-order bride service. I did not go looking for a woman. I downloaded a language exchange app called HelloTalk, and I put in my profile that I was a retired history teacher, 71 years old, interested in serious study, willing to trade English for Vietnamese with a native speaker of any age. I meant that last phrase honestly. I imagined a middle-aged Hanoi school teacher, or a university student who wanted to move to America, or a Ho Chi Minh City businesswoman practicing for a professional certification. I did not imagine what I got. I got on the 3rd day a message from a girl named Pham Thier Ngoc Ha, who told me she was 19 and lived in Haiphong and was hoping to study English literature and had never spoken to a real English teacher before. She wrote in careful, slow sentences with the punctuation of someone who had been taught to be respectful of it. Her profile photograph showed her sitting on a stone bench in front of a temple, with her hair in a single braid pulled forward over one shoulder, wearing a plain white blouse. She was very beautiful. I registered that fact, the way an old man registers weather. It was there, and I noted it, and I moved past it, because a beautiful 19-year-old girl was, in my mental accounting, a fact about the world and not a fact about my future. 8 other people had messaged me in those first 3 days. I had replied politely to all of them. Only Ha kept writing back. Our first video call was a week later, at 7 in the morning her time, which was 6 in the evening mine. She apologized for her English 3 times in the first minute. I apologized for my Vietnamese, which consisted of 2 phrases and a wildly incorrect pronunciation of the word for hello. We laughed, and the laugh was the thing I remember most, because I had not laughed with a woman since Kate died, and the sound of it in my own throat surprised me. She had a small, round face and enormous, serious eyes, and she leaned close to the camera when I said something she did not understand, as if she could get closer to the meaning by getting closer to the screen. She was reading, she told me, a translation of Hemingway. She did not quite understand why the old man in the story kept talking to the fish. I explained it to her for 40 minutes. She listened. When the call ended, she wrote afterward to say, "Thank you, teacher. That was the best English lesson I have ever had. I want you to understand what that sentence did to me. I had been a teacher my whole life. I had been called teacher by thousands of teenagers, most of them bored, some of them kind, a handful over the decades genuinely engaged. I had not been called teacher in that particular tone since Kate, who used to call me teacher when she was teasing me for lecturing her over dinner. Ha said it seriously. She said it as if the word were still a title of respect in a country that still believed teachers were worth something. I sat in my kitchen in Sarasota with the phone in my hand, and I felt, for the first time in nearly 4 years, that some small, useful part of me was still working. We began calling every day, 90 minutes each. She would come to the call at 7 in the morning her time, wet-haired from the bath, in the white blouse, with a mug of tea. I would sit at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a cup of coffee. She read me poetry in Vietnamese, first the folk poems, and then Ho Xuan Hung, and eventually the long soft passages of Nguyen Du, whose tale of Keo I had known about my whole life and never actually read. I read her passages of Steinbeck, first The Pearl because it was short, and then Of Mice and Men because she wanted to know why Americans were so sad about their friends. She corrected my tones. I would try to say the word for mother, and I would land instead on the word for rice, and she would laugh, not unkindly, and say again, "Teacher, listen," and she would demonstrate, and I would try again, and eventually I would get it right, and she would praise me, and the praise was warm water on skin that had been cold for years. I did not know that I was cold until I was warm, and I did not know that I was warm until I was drowning. Nothing sexual passed between us in the first months. This is the part I need my daughter to understand, and the part I need you to understand, because I have come to see that it was not an accident. Han never flirted with me in the register I'd been warned about by the vague American mythology of Southeast Asian women that I had absorbed without ever examining. She did not send suggestive photographs. She did not use pet names. She did not speak of love. She spoke of literature and pronunciation, and occasionally of her grandmother, whom she lived with, whom she adored. She spoke of her mother, a seamstress with terrible pain in her hands, who nonetheless made her breakfast every morning. She spoke of studying, to be worthy of the university she hoped to attend. She treated me the way a serious student treats a serious teacher. I had spent my life defending myself against the wrong seductions. I had built no defense against this one. The first money I sent was for a Kindle. She had mentioned in passing that the paperback of a novel we had been discussing cost more in Hanoi than she could easily justify, and I said, without thinking, "Let me send you a Kindle. They are wonderful. You can carry a whole library." She refused 3 times. She said it was too much. She could not accept. She would find another way. I insisted. I felt the specific pleasure of the gift, the teacher's pleasure, of putting a book in the hand of a student who wanted one. The Kindle cost about $140, including the international shipping. She sent me a photograph when it arrived, holding it up in both hands, smiling. And I looked at that photograph for a long time, and I told myself I had done a good thing. A month later, I bought her a laptop. Her old one was so slow that the video calls froze. I bought her the laptop because I wanted to see her clearly. That is an honest sentence, and I want to say it plainly. I told myself I was investing in the language partnership. The laptop cost about $800. She cried when it arrived. She said she would repay me somehow. I said she already had, by teaching me the word for cloud, which I had been trying to pronounce for 2 weeks. Then a subscription to a language app, because we both wanted better vocabulary lists. Then a small monthly amount, $200, so she could reduce the hours she was spending at what she described as a part-time job at a Haiphong cafe and study more. That request, when it came, arrived wrapped inside an apology and a promise. I said yes immediately. $200 a month was less than I had once spent on wine in a good month with Kate. I did not miss it. I registered it in my private ledger as an educational expense. By the 5th month I had sent her, in scattered payments, just over $2,000. I had never once thought of it as sending her money. I had thought of it as a Kindle, a laptop, a subscription, and a small monthly stipend, so a promising young student could study more and work less. Each individual transaction was defensible in the private court, where I was both prosecutor and judge. It is only now, looking back, that I understand what a well-designed sequence it was. A person building a slow scam knows that the first phase is not extraction. The first phase is training. She was training me to give in small, comfortable amounts on friendly grounds without embarrassment. She was training me to feel good about giving. By the time the real requests came, I was not going to feel that I had suddenly started paying for something. I was going to feel that I had always been paying, and that the amounts had simply grown along with the relationship. Around the 6th month, I told her I wanted to visit Hanoi. I said I would come for 11 days, and I would like her, if she was willing, to be my language teacher for that time, and I would pay her a proper daily rate. I framed it that way because I was trying to be respectful. I was trying to say, without saying, that I did not expect anything else. She wrote back that she would be honored, teacher, and that she would like to show me her country properly, and that I did not need to pay her anything, only the shared expenses of the days themselves. I insisted on the daily rate. She refused. I insisted again. She refused again. Eventually, I stopped insisting, because I had realized that to keep insisting was to insult her. I flew to Hanoi in the early fall. I remember the plane descending through low gray cloud in the sudden green expanse of the Delta and the feeling in my chest that I had spent my whole professional life pointing at a place on a map, and now I was going to walk on it. She met me at the airport in the white blouse, with her hair in the braid, holding a small hand-lettered sign that said, "Welcome, Teacher David." I saw her before she saw me. I remember thinking she was smaller in person than I had prepared for, and younger and unmistakably real. She saw me and put her hand over her mouth, and then took it away and smiled, and I walked toward her the way you walk toward the last passenger at an empty gate. The 11 days that followed were the happiest of my life since Kate died. I know how that sentence will sound. I would like to say it anyway because I owe it to Kate and to Sarah and to whoever is listening to be honest. Ha took me to the old quarter and taught me how to cross the street, which is a real skill, not a joke. She took me to a small restaurant on a side street where the woman who owned it had been cooking the same one dish, a specific version of bun cha, for 40 years. And she translated for me while the owner told me about her father who had died in the war on the North Side. She took me to the Temple of Literature and walked me through the stelae of the graduated scholars and told me which dynasty each one belonged to. And when I quizzed her afterward, she got 7 of 8 right and apologized for the 8th. She took me to a bookshop on Din Lair Street where I bought a bilingual edition of The Tale of Kiu, and she inscribed it for me in Vietnamese and made me translate the inscription out loud until I got it right, which took me 40 minutes and made a shopkeeper laugh at us. She did not sleep with me. She did not kiss me. She took my elbow when the sidewalks were crowded, and she once, on the last night, leaned her head briefly against my shoulder while we sat on a low plastic stool watching a woman fry donuts in a wok on the pavement. That was the extent of the physical intimacy of the trip. I understand now, in a way I could not have understood then, that this was a calibration of remarkable psychological precision. A woman who was running the scam I would have recognized would have escalated. She would have made the trip about sex. She would have shown me what I could have if I stayed. Ha did the opposite. She made the trip about my mind. She asked me questions about the war, about the American classroom, about my daughter, about Kate. She listened. She wrote things down in a small notebook. She was, in every observable respect, the serious student of a serious old teacher who had come from very far away to give her his time. I flew home to Sarasota transformed. I want you to hear that word carefully. I did not fly home in love, in the ordinary sense of the phrase. I flew home reoriented. For the first time since the spring my wife died, I could see a shape of a future that was not simply a series of Tuesday breakfasts diminishing toward the end. I could see a world with a purpose in it, and the purpose was called learning, and it lived in Hanoi. The romantic feeling, if I am being honest, was secondary. It was real, but it was secondary. What she had given me, and I use the word given deliberately, was permission to imagine that the last chapter of my life could contain more than mourning. I waited 2 months before I told Sarah. That is the part I regret most in a story full of regrettable parts, because 2 months of silence toward the person who loved me most was already a form of the disappearance to come. When I finally called her, one Sunday evening from the porch in Sarasota, I told her the outline first. Language partner. Trip to Hanoi. Very fond of her. Thinking about spending more time in Vietnam. Sarah listened for the length of the outline and then asked me one question. She said, "Dad, how old is she?" I told her. There was a silence I will remember until the day I die. Then Sarah said, in the voice she uses in her occupational therapy sessions, with patients who are lying to themselves about their own recoveries, "Dad, will you please, before you do anything, will you please talk to me, or to a lawyer, or to somebody who does not have a stake in the answer?" I said I would. I did not. I thought about calling a lawyer 3 separate times over the next several weeks. Each time I stopped because I did not want to hear what a lawyer would say. I already knew what a lawyer would say. I had been a teacher of the humanities for 34 years. I was capable of imagining every argument against my own decisions. I made the decisions anyway, because the arguments felt like the arguments of a life that had already ended, and the decisions felt like the arguments of a life that might still begin. I listed the condominium in the early winter. It sold in 6 weeks for $271,000, which was fair, and which felt like an obscene amount of money to be holding in a single check. I was already making other arrangements. I had, on a previous call with Ha, mentioned that I did not know how to move funds to Vietnam sensibly, and she had said, very gently, that her cousin worked at a bank in Hanoi and could help me open a joint account so that she could assist me with day-to-day expenses while I was learning the language. That word, joint, did not sound the alarm it should have sounded. I heard it as practical. I heard it as intimacy. I heard it as the sort of thing a couple building a shared life would naturally do. She was, remember, in my mind, the woman I had walked with in the old quarter at dusk, whose grandmother she cared for, whose mother's hands ached at the sewing machine. She was not a woman who would rob me. She was a woman for whom I would gladly consent to shared arrangements. I wired $240,000 into that joint account in the early spring. I kept about $30,000 in an American account for emergencies, which turned out to be a decision that would eventually keep me alive. I put my books in storage. I gave away most of Kate's clothes to a church resale shop on Fruitville Road. I kept her reading glasses in a small padded envelope in my carry-on. I flew to Hanoi on a 3-month tourist visa. I intended to convert to something longer once I was on the ground. The conversion turned out to be much more complicated than I had been told, and the person who had told me it would be simple was, as it happened, the same person for whom the complication was useful. Ha met me at the airport again, in the white blouse again, and it seemed to me, in the humid dazzle of the arrivals hall, that nothing that had happened between the first trip and this one had happened. The whole intervening time, the sale of the condominium, the difficult call with Sarah, the storage locker in Sarasota, the last walk around the empty screened porch. All of it collapsed into a single sensation of at last, at last, at last. She had rented, or had had her cousin rent, an apartment in the Hoan Kim district on a quiet lane behind the cathedral for $1,100 a month. It was, by Hanoi standards, expensive. It had a small balcony with a view of a lemon tree in a courtyard. She had put flowers on the kitchen counter. She had put a bilingual dictionary on the bedside table. She had put a framed print of a Vietnamese watercolor of Ho Tay on the wall opposite the bed. She did not live in the apartment full-time. That was explained to me on the second day, gently, with obvious pain. Her mother's arthritis was worse than she had let on. She had to be in Haiphong at least half of each week to help her grandmother care for her mother. She hoped I would understand. She hoped I would not feel abandoned. She said that when she was in Hanoi, she was fully mine, and when she was in Haiphong, her heart was still in Hanoi. And would I please believe her? I believed her. I would have believed her if she had told me the walls of the apartment were made of rice paper. The arrangement in practice meant that she was in the apartment about 3 nights a week, and the rest of the time I was alone in it, studying Vietnamese from workbooks she had bought me, walking to the small cafe down the lane where the owner had started calling me Thay, teacher, and cooking simple meals in a kitchen designed for a smaller person than me. The request began, in that phase, as shared life expenses. That is a phrase I would like you to remember, because it is the specific mechanism, and I did not see it as a mechanism until it was far too late. She did not ask me for gifts. She asked me for our rent. She asked me for our groceries. She asked me for our electric bill. She asked me for a scooter she needed to get to and from Haiphong more easily so that she could be with me in Hanoi more often. The scooter cost about $1,900. She was very grateful. The registration was, for reasons involving Vietnamese law and her cousin at the bank, put in her name. I did not think about it at the time. I thought about the fact that she was going to be in Hanoi more. Her mother's medication was about $400 a month. This was real. I met her mother once, a small, brittle woman with hands that could no longer button a blouse without help, and I understood that the medication was not fictional and that her pain was not fictional, and the small amount I contributed toward it was among the few pieces of the whole arrangement I do not regret. Her grandmother needed cataract surgery on both eyes. That was $3,800. I met the grandmother the day before the surgery. She sat across from me at a low table in a 2-room house in a lane where the sewage backed up when it rained, and she held my hand for a long moment and did not look at me, and I mistook that for shyness. It was shame. I did not know it was shame until months later when I sat in the guest house room with the ceiling fan that does not quite work, and I remembered the shape of her hand around mine, and I understood. The roof of the house in Haiphong needed to be replaced. That was $6,200. The neighbors were grateful. I paid it. Then Ha wanted to enroll in a proper language school in Hanoi, a serious one that would prepare her to take the entrance exam at a real university. That was about $2,500 a semester. I paid it. She attended for a while, and then stopped attending, and told me she had been ill, and I understood her to be ill, and did not press for details. If you've been enjoying the stories I tell, please consider sticking with me through this next part, because it is the part where the pattern becomes visible. And the pattern is more important than any single number. What I've described so far, over the first year of living in Hanoi, amounted to somewhere between $40,000 and $50,000. I did not add it up. This was the first mistake of the second phase, and the mistake was not accidental. I had built a life in Sarasota with Kate, in which I never really added anything up. We were both employed. We both had pensions. Money came in and money went out, and once a quarter we sat down with a spreadsheet and made sure nothing was on fire. In Hanoi, in the apartment behind the cathedral, I stopped adding. I stopped adding because the mechanism of the joint account made adding difficult, and I stopped adding because Ha did not seem to be adding either, and I stopped adding because the woman who used to help me add was buried under a live oak tree in a cemetery in Utica. The scale began to change around the 14th month. Ha announced one evening at the small round table in the apartment that she had been thinking about her future. She could not be a language student forever. She wanted to start something. Specifically, she wanted to start an online Vietnamese language tutoring platform for Western learners. She had done research. She had a name for it. She had, she said, spoken to a web developer who could build the site. The initial investment would be about $18,000, which would cover the developer's fees, the initial licensing, a proper laptop for professional use, marketing to the first students, and a small legal retainer for the business registration. She showed me a printed one-page plan. It had a logo. She had thought about the logo. I paid the $18,000. I paid it not because I believed in the business, though I did believe in it in the pleasant abstract way I believed in most of her hopes, but because the request represented, in my mental accounting, a shift toward her having a future that was not dependent on me. That is the sentence I remember thinking. I remember thinking that if she had her own business, she would be less financially anchored to our arrangement, and that this would be a healthy development, and that if I truly cared about her, I would want her to have this. I did not understand then that a scammer of her particular type is not extracting money in defiance of your rationalizations. She is extracting money by supplying you with better rationalizations than you could have supplied yourself. Every payment she requested came pre-wrapped in a story that made me feel more, not less, like a good man. That was the technology of the scam. Not seduction, justification. The platform launched. It had 3 students. All 3 were Western men in their 60s. I asked her one afternoon whether she wanted to try to recruit more students, and she smiled the small, worried smile she had started using with me, and said that she was worried the site was not yet ready for larger numbers. She wanted to improve it first. Improving it, in the following months, required an additional $4,000, then $3,000 more, then a specialized software subscription for $1,100 a month. Each request arrived softly. Each request was accompanied by 3 days of especially attentive care. I understood in some part of me that was not yet allowed to speak, that the care was the currency in which she was paying me for the money. That understanding was in the back of a very deep drawer, and I kept the drawer closed. Around the 17th month, I received the first letter from the Internal Revenue Service. It went to Sarah's address in Rochester, because I had never updated my forwarding address after selling the condominium in Sarasota. Sarah did not open the first letter. She did not open the second. She opened the third. What she found there was a notice that the tranches I had been liquidating from my retirement account to feed the joint account in Hanoi were being reported as taxable distributions, that I had not filed the necessary paperwork, that I was accruing penalties, and that the total American tax liability, if left to compound, was going to reach a figure that neither Sarah nor I had prepared for. Sarah called me at 7 in the morning her time, which was 7 in the evening mine. Ha was in Haiphong that night. I was alone in the apartment with a bowl of soup and a Vietnamese grammar workbook. Sarah did not shout. Sarah has never in her life shouted at me. She said, "Dad, I have opened a letter I should not have had to open, and I need you to listen to me." She read me the amount. It was $41,000 in liabilities and growing. I did not know what to say. I said I was aware there might be some tax matters to sort out. Sarah said, "Dad." Sarah said my name 3 times, and each time it was quieter. Then she said, "Please, please, please come home." She said it in the voice she had used the summer her mother was dying, when she was standing at the foot of the hospital bed and I was holding Kate's hand and none of us could look at each other. That voice, in my ear, in an apartment behind a cathedral in Hanoi, opened the drawer. I told her I would think about it. I hung up. I sat at the small round table for a long time. I thought about what a life would look like if I went back to Sarasota. I did not own a condominium in Sarasota anymore. I did not have friends in Sarasota. I did not have Kate in Sarasota. What I had, if I went back, was Sarah in Rochester, and my 2 grandsons, and a rented studio somewhere, and the specific, unbearable admission that would have to come first. I would have to tell my daughter that I had thrown away her inheritance on a fantasy. I would have to say the word fantasy out loud in her kitchen. I could not do it. That was the decision I made that night, sitting at the small round table with the soup gone cold in front of me. I could not do it. So I would find a way to make Hanoi work, and I would find a way to convince Ha that we needed to be more careful, and I would find a way to sort out the American tax problem later, and I would not think about any of it until I had to. The requests over the following months did not slow. Her mother needed to see a specialist in Singapore. That was $14,000 for the flights and the consultation and the pre-authorization deposit. There was a family debt from her father's second wife's medical bills that had, somehow, fallen to Ha's household to repay. That was $9,000. There was a problem with the business, involving a payment gateway and a legal filing and a very specific tax circumstance she did not have the English to explain to me and did not want to try, and that would take $11,000 to resolve. Each request came through tears. Each request was accompanied by her offering, unprompted, to give up the apartment and move back to Haiphong full-time so as not to be a burden on me. Each offer was withdrawn, in relief and gratitude. Once I said no, of course not. We will find the money. We. I heard the word we in my own voice on those evenings, and I did not hear the trap in it. The trap was in the pronoun. Around the 22nd month, the retirement account was, for practical purposes, gone. The condominium money was gone. What remained of the pension and Social Security still arrived each month into the joint account, and I could still draw modest amounts of cash for daily life, though the withdrawals over certain thresholds now required both signatures for reasons. Ha explained with a shrug about Vietnamese banking rules, and I accepted without checking. I lived on the cash. I studied Vietnamese. I began to notice, as any careful person eventually would, that Ha was in Haiphong more than she had been. 4 nights a week, then 5, then once, 7 in a row. Her calls when she was there were shorter. She was tired. She was sick. She was worried about her mother. Each excuse was individually plausible. It was the sum that had begun to become a shape. I began, without admitting to myself that I was doing it, to look at her Zalo when she left her phone charging in the kitchen. I did not read the messages. I did not know enough Vietnamese to read the messages. I looked at the timestamps and the names and the frequency. There was a name I did not recognize that appeared often. There was a name that had, in her contacts, a small heart emoji next to it. That was the only clue I gave myself, and I gave it to myself only once, and I did not follow it, because I could not bear to follow it. I put the phone back on the counter, and I went out onto the balcony, and I looked at the lemon tree in the courtyard, and I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself, old men who had been through what I had been through often became paranoid. I told myself Kate would have laughed at me for looking at another woman's phone. The end, when it came, did not come as a confrontation. It came as a locked door at the bank. I went in on a Tuesday morning to withdraw $12,000 because a Vietnamese tax bill had appeared, connected to the business, and I wanted to pay it before it grew. The teller was polite. She smiled at me. She looked at her screen, and her smile went slowly formal, and she said, "In careful English, sir, this withdrawal requires the co-signatory." I said I understood. The co-signatory would come in tomorrow. The teller nodded. I walked out. I called Ha from the sidewalk. Her phone rang and went to a voicemail that was, in Vietnamese, hers. I called again and again. I sent a Zalo message. The message went unread. She did not answer for 2 days. Those 2 days are, in my memory, a single very long day. I did not eat. I did not sleep more than an hour at a stretch. I sat on the balcony, and I looked at the lemon tree, and I looked at the phone, and I looked at the door of the apartment, and I understood. In the ordinary way, old teachers understand things when there is nothing left to do but understand, that I had walked into something whose shape I had refused to see for more than 2 years, and that the shape was closing around me now, and that there was very little I was going to be able to do about it. She called on the evening of the second day. She was crying. She told me she had made a mistake. She told me her family had, in her absence, been arranging a marriage to a Vietnamese man, a distant cousin, and that she must obey. She told me she was ashamed. She told me she could not see me anymore, and that she was sorry, and that she would remember our time together always as a beautiful chapter, and that she would ensure the paperwork on the joint account was resolved cleanly. She said the words beautiful chapter. I heard the phrase, and I recognized it. In the dead metallic way, you recognize a phrase you have read in a book you cannot quite place. I did not argue. I did not beg. I said, "All right, Ha." I said, "All right." Then I hung up, and I sat in the apartment, and I did not cry, because the specific animal in me that cried had gone somewhere else and had not come back yet. Sarah found me a lawyer, not through any expertise of her own, but by calling an old college friend whose husband did international work and getting a name and passing it to me. The lawyer was a man in his 50s, quiet, careful, with an office in a narrow building near the Opera House. He listened to my story for nearly 2 hours without interrupting once. When I was done, he closed his notebook and looked at me for a while before he spoke. He said, "Teacher, I am sorry." He used the Vietnamese word for teacher, not the English. He said, "Teacher, I am sorry." And then he explained in the plainest terms he could what my options were. He said the joint account was structured such that withdrawals above the local equivalent of about $1,000 required both signatures. He said the business was in her name. He said the apartment lease was in her name. He said the scooter was in her name. He said the tuition I had paid was not recoverable. He said I could, if I wished, initiate civil proceedings, which would take between 2 and 4 years, and would require capital I no longer possessed, and would, in his professional estimation, recover a fraction of what I had lost, even in a favorable outcome. He said the other option was to accept whatever she was willing to release from the joint account in exchange for a signed agreement not to pursue anything. He said, "Teacher, I am sorry," again. And he charged me a reduced fee, and I understood that he was charging me a reduced fee because he had seen this story enough times that his professional detachment was, as he said carefully, beginning to fail him. I signed the agreement. She released $31,000 from the joint account. That was what I walked out of Hanoi with, in the practical sense. I still had the pension and the Social Security. I still had the American tax liability. I still had the shame, which is a currency I had not previously known could be transacted in. I could not afford to fly home. That is the specific arithmetic that put me in the guest house. A flight from Hanoi to New York was more than $1,500, and I owed the American tax authorities. And I owed my daughter the money she was going to have to spend on the accountant, who was going to have to sort my situation out, and I could not walk into her house in Rochester with what remained of my life in 2 suitcases. I could not ask her for the ticket, because asking would require the conversation I could not yet have. I told her I needed a few weeks to settle affairs. She did not believe me. She wired me $900 anyway. She has been wiring me $900 every month since. I moved out of the apartment behind the cathedral on a Tuesday morning. The lemon tree was still in the courtyard. I remember stopping at the door and looking at it and feeling that I owed it something, an apology or an acknowledgement. I walked with 2 suitcases to a guest house an American backpacker had recommended years ago on a forum I had once read on Kate's laptop out of curiosity. The guest house is in a narrow alley off Hangback Street. My room is on the 4th floor. The stairs are hard on my hip. The room costs 750,000 dong a night, which comes out to about $30 American. The ceiling fan does not quite work. When it rains, the wall by the window darkens in a specific stain shaped a little like the state of Michigan. I have been in this room for 4 months as I write this. I teach English lessons on a video app for $8 an hour to Vietnamese teenagers whose parents want them to sound American. The teenagers are polite. I am a good teacher. I have been a good teacher my whole life, and the specific competence of a good teacher is one of the few things that has not been taken from me. I make between $400 and $600 a month this way. Combined with what Sarah sends, and what I can carefully draw from the pension after the American tax accountant she hired takes his share, I have enough for the room, for 2 meals a day, at a pho stand on Hang Bo Street, for the metformin I buy over the counter at a pharmacy on Hang Dung Street, and for the small amount of coffee I still allow myself in the morning. I met a Belgian man at that pho stand last month. He is around 60, quiet, has been in Vietnam for a long time. He looked at me over his bowl and asked me, in the friendly, cautious way of long-term expatriates, how long I had been in the country. I told him. He asked me what had brought me. I looked at him, and I could not lie, because I no longer have the strength for the lies I used to have the strength for, and I told him the outline. He listened. He finished his soup. He said, "Mate, we all thought ours was different too." Then he bought me a beer. I would like now, in what remains, to say the things I have learned, because if my daughter is going to keep sending me $900 a month, and if the readers of this channel are going to spend an hour listening to an old man in a guest house, then the minimum I owe both is honesty about what I now understand. The first thing I have understood is that the scam that took me was not the scam I had been warned about. I had been warned, vaguely, my whole life, about beer bars and hostesses and the specific traps set for lonely, older Western men in Southeast Asia. I had built, without ever really thinking about it, a small internal defense against those specific traps. What Ha ran was not that. Ha ran a long, low-grade, patient operation that used the apparatus of language learning and video calls to strip me of everything over the course of more than 2 years. And she never once did anything that a lonely, widowed history teacher would have registered as the beginning of a scam. She did not send me suggestive photographs. She did not tell me she loved me for months and months. She did not ask for gifts. She read me poetry. She let me correct her English. She treated me as a mind. My defenses had been built against the wrong door. The second thing I've understood is that the money went out of me the way water goes out of a leaking house, in small drops, in reasonable places, for reasonable reasons, over a long time. I did not have a single moment where I handed over a large sum against my judgment. I had 2 years of moments in which I handed over medium sums with the full endorsement of my judgment, because my judgment had been recalibrated to endorse them. That is the specific mechanism I want you to hear. The scam did not defeat my judgment. The scam colonized my judgment. By the end, I was making arguments to myself that Ha would have made if she had been standing in the room, and I was making them better than she could have made them, and I was making them without her having to be present. The third thing I have understood is that the loneliness was the door. Kate would not have let this happen. That is not a mystical statement. It is a practical one. Kate would have looked at the first Kindle and said, "David, why?" She would have looked at me over her glasses in the way she had, and she would have said the 2 words, and I would have known. When she died, the person who used to say those 2 words to me died, and I did not replace her. And I did not want to replace her. And the specific vacancy she left was, in its exact shape, the specific space that Ha walked into. If you are a widower or a widow watching this, I would like you to understand that the danger is not that you will be seduced. The danger is that the specific voice that used to say, "David, why?" is gone from your kitchen, and that no algorithm on any app has been built to replace that voice, and that the internet is full of very intelligent young people who have understood this before you have. The fourth thing I have understood is that expertise about a country is not the same as understanding the people who live in it. I taught the Vietnam War for 34 years. I could tell you the timeline of the Tet Offensive. I could tell you the exact tonnage of American bombs dropped on the North. I could draw the Ho Chi Minh Trail on a chalkboard from memory. I believed, in the private smug way that even good teachers sometimes believe things, that this made me a person who understood Vietnam. It did not. It made me a person who understood a specific American story about Vietnam. The Vietnam that Ha lives in a lane in Hai Phong where the sewage backs up in typhoon season, is not the Vietnam I had a print of a Larry Burroughs photograph over my desk about. The gap between the Vietnam I had studied and the Vietnam I had walked into was precisely the space in which she was able to work. I did not know. I did not know. That is the most dangerous kind of not knowing. The fifth thing I have understood is that the shame of admitting this is the specific fuel that keeps men in my situation from admitting it. I have read, In the online forums I now spend perhaps too much time on, dozens of stories that begin the way mine begins. Almost all of them are told by men in guest houses, or in rented rooms, or in the small apartments they have rented from their adult children. Almost all of them describe the same mechanism I have described. And almost all of them come with the same private shame, which is that the man telling the story is convinced, in some small buried place, that his situation is unique and that he is uniquely stupid, and that no other man has been quite as ruined as he has been. That belief is a lie. The lie is manufactured by the same scam that manufactured the loss. The lie exists because as long as I believe I am uniquely stupid, I will not tell my story. And if I do not tell my story, the woman who ran mine will run yours. Her name in the messages was Ha. That was one of her real names. I do not know if it was the one she used with the Canadian who came before me, or the Frenchman who came before him, or the Australian who is on the calls with her now. My daughter's investigator has spoken to the Canadian and the Frenchman. They both took the loss and told no one. The Australian does not yet know he is in a queue. I do not have a way to reach him. I have thought about it. My lawyer says any attempt would expose me to legal risk under the terms of the agreement I signed. So, I am recording this, and I am hoping that if the Australian, or someone like him, is watching this in the small hours of a morning in Adelaide, on the screen of a laptop his own new 19-year-old language partner recommended, he will understand something that I did not understand. That the calibration of the person on the other end of his video calls is not personal to him, that it has been perfected on men before him, and that he is not chosen, he is scheduled. I do not know how this ends for me. I would like to be able to tell you that Sarah is arriving on a Thursday to bring me home. She is not. We have discussed it. We are not ready. She needs more time to look at me the way she used to look at me. And I need more time to be a man who can bear being looked at that way. In the meantime, I stay in the room off Hangback Street. I pay my $30 every morning to the young woman at the front desk who has stopped, in recent weeks, saying good morning to me in English and started saying it in Vietnamese, which is her small, quiet kindness. I teach my teenagers. I walk in the old quarter in the early evening when the heat has broken, and I go to the pho stand where I met the Belgian, and I sit on the low plastic stool and I eat, and I nod at the woman who runs the stand, who has begun to nod back, and who has never once asked me why an old American is eating alone every night at her stand. The last thing I want to say, before I let you go, is about the grandmother. Her name was Farm Thier Twet. She was 78. She had the cataract surgery I paid for, and she could see, for the first time in years, the faces of the people at her own table. On the last afternoon, I was in Haiphong, before it all fell apart, before the withdrawal was blocked, and the phone went to voicemail, and the beautiful chapter was invoked. The grandmother slipped a small brown paper bag into my hand as I was leaving. She did not look at me. She did not speak English. The bag had dried longan in it, the kind that comes from a specific region of the Delta that she had, I later learned, made herself. I did not eat them for weeks. I did not understand what they were. I found them in a side pocket of my suitcase in the guest house on a hard evening, and I sat on the plastic bed with the fan not quite working, and I ate them one by one, and I cried for 40 minutes, because I understood finally what the grandmother had been trying to tell me by not looking at me. She had been trying to tell me that she knew. She had been trying to apologize, in the only language that was still available to her, for a granddaughter she loved and could not stop. The dried longan was her apology. It was the only apology I received in this entire story, and it came from a woman who had no obligation to offer one. I keep the paper bag on the small table by the window. It is empty. I have not thrown it away. My name is David Holloway. I am 73 years old. I live in a room in an alley off Hangback Street in Hanoi, and I sleep under a ceiling fan that does not quite work, and I pay $30 American in worn Vietnamese notes for another night here every morning. And I am telling you this story because there is a version of me watching this right now, in Adelaide, or in Toronto, or in a 55-plus community in Sarasota, who has just downloaded a language exchange app because he has always meant to learn something, and who has just received the 9th message, and who is thinking, what is the harm? The harm is a room. The harm is a stain on a wall that looks like Michigan. The harm is a bag of dried longan. The harm is a daughter's voice, 3,000 miles away, in a kitchen you can no longer walk into. I would ask you, if any of what I have said has landed anywhere in you, to consider subscribing to this channel, because there are other stories the person who runs it needs to be able to tell, and telling them takes time he does not always have. And I would ask you, more importantly, to please, if there is an old man in your life who has lost his wife and gone quiet, to sit with him for an hour this week, and let him tell you about a book he is reading, and let him correct your pronunciation of something. That hour is the hour that saves him. I did not have anyone to give me that hour, and I gave it to Ha instead. And Ha gave it back to me at 7 in the morning her time, and I do not know, even now, whether I am angrier at her or more grateful. That is what I have not been able to work out, sitting in this room all these months. I loved her. Some part of me still does. She was not real, and I loved her anyway, and I do not know what to do with a love that was given to a person who did not exist. The teachers who trained me in the humanities did not prepare me for that particular problem. I am working on it. I will keep working on it. I do not know how much time I have, but what I have, I will spend trying to understand it. Please be careful. Please be honest with the people who love you. Please, if you are alone, be alone in the company of people who can see you. Thank you for listening. My name is David Halloway. I hope you never have to write a message like this to a stranger on the internet. And if you do, I hope someone reads it.